Welcome to BearyVaried and welcome to the discussion. I'm John, and today we're going to be talking about what I think is the easiest way to ruin a horror movie. A lot of folks think that by virtue, sequels are going to be inferior to the originals, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and that's what we're going to explore today. If you're new to the channel, hit subscribe because all we do is talk movies all day. Let's get started. Title: The easiest way to ruin a horror movie. Subtitle: Is low budget horror better? Yes. That's the point I'm going to be making today. While it's not 100% true for every single franchise and every single movie, this is the single most likely, most probable trend that I've come to notice in horror movies that drop the ball when it comes to the sequel. But don't worry, because we're not just here to hate on sequels. At the end, we're going to be talking a little bit about a few of the franchises that avoid this common mistake. Obviously, this little gem right here, Halloween 1978, for the longest time was the single most successful independent film of all time. But it was only dethroned by Paranormal Activity in 2009 just because it had an insanely low budget. So, the original Halloween, the John Carpenter classic, is famously made for 300 grand approximately. A lot of people kind of nitpick the numbers, 275, 300. We're gonna say 300 for the sake of this video. He was essentially just out of film school. This was his first major movie. It was involving friends in the crew and that kind of stuff to keep it so low. This is actually a larger trend. While there's a Halloween, then there are also modern day movies that have a surprisingly low budget for the time, adjusted for inflation and whatnot, that also reaffirm this theory. Haunt just came out recently. It has a substantially lower budget and it really gets everything right where it needs to. So, starting off, one reason why low budget horror is better is that it forces the filmmakers to focus more time of the movie on building characters, characterization, and making sure that we actually care about the folks in the movie and have an understanding of where they're coming from, the gravity of the circumstances involved. And so if you do not have a huge budget, that means you cannot show the villain, the monster, the killer as much on screen. And by virtue of that, you happen to end up with a better movie because you actually have characters you care about and they aren't just fodder for the villain. 2, it requires the filmmakers to be more resourceful, more innovative, and more creative with what they have at their disposal. If you don't have a huge budget, then you have to be really wise about your decisions, and anything that you are going to spend money on is going to be because it's relevant, it serves the story better, it makes it a better experience overall. 3, it requires the filmmakers to use more practical effects and rely less on CG. And I think we all know at this point, practical effects hold up far better over time than CG does. 4, it requires the filmmaker to focus more time building atmosphere and suspense. And I think we all know that psychological horror sticks with you a little bit longer than a jump scare does. It's that kind of thing you mull over the next day, the next day, the next day. 5, it makes the film feel more visceral, tangible, and believable, which only heightens how scary it is. I come to think of movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, filmed on 8mm film. It's grainy. That grain adds so much to the grittiness of it and therefore the scariness of it. It's not this clean, polished, high budget kind of production. You know, it feels like it exists within the subject matter itself. Nitty gritty, scary as hell. 6, if your movie has a low budget, it often means that the studio does not have a whole lot of confidence in it. It knows that the film alone can't rely on name recognition, franchise recognition, and that's a good thing because ultimately that gives the filmmaker something to prove. 7, it often requires the filmmakers to hire new up-and-coming talent. You're not going to be watching the movie focused on a celebrity. You're focused on characters, not the actor, and therefore instantly more immersive. In the last 20 years or so, we've had a lot of great horror movies that have been pretty low budget. I'm thinking 2016's Terrifier, right? I mean, just look at that face. Says it all. And that movie was made for $100,000. We also have, famously, The Blair Witch Project, love it or hate it, in 1999. It was the shit and everyone was going berserk over it, and that movie cost $60,000 to make. And I think the one that really puts the icing on the cake is Paranormal Activity, as mentioned earlier. It was made for only $11,000, and that was in 2009. You know, and we're looking at, Halloween, which I'm not saying Paranormal Activity is a superior film to Halloween, but Halloween was made in 1978 for $300,000. So the fact that in the 90s or early 2000s you're coming out with movies that are even a fraction of that budget is incredible. But I think the most direct comparison that we can make are the budgets of original classics and then sequels within the same franchise. So that's what we're going to focus on. So let's start with The Descent. Anyone who's seen The Descent knows that it just encompasses claustrophobia and creepiness to the next level. Now, The Descent was released in 2005, and since it was done by the jolly old Brits, then our budget for that is actually in pounds. And I'm terrible with numbers, so let me dip to my resource here to make sure I get this right. It was made for £3.5 million. Hyper effective. The entire movie really takes place in this cave system, which was replicated cheaply on set using the same set pieces in a soundstage and then just rearranged slightly to create different looking aspects of the cave. But it was really all made with the same pieces of cave wall, as it were. And it was a hit. It was hyper effective. Now we go from that to the sequel, The Descent Part 2, very cleverly named. My resources here tell me The Descent 2 came out in 2009 and it cost $6.2 million because this time it was filmed by an American director. But you see right there, the difference is we have this increase in budget. We have a complete changing of hands of the filmmakers and production crew. And what we end up getting in The Descent 2 is nowhere near as much character development, and it feels like the movie is rushing to get to the subterranean monsters. And what's beautiful about the original Descent is that you don't see the first monster until almost an hour into the film. And so what are you doing? You're building suspense, you're building characters. Something Part 2 didn't spend so much time on. Now this one's gonna be a blast for folks because I know the remake was very warmly embraced by the horror community. Alright, the original A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984, made for a mere $1.8 million. Horror classic. I mean, how many people couldn't sleep at night because of this movie? It was just groundbreaking for the time. As if Wes Craven needed any more groundbreaking horror films, then this is just another one to add to his impressive resume. Now you take that and you contrast it with a 2010 remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Guess what the difference is in the budget? We go from $1.8 million to $35 million to get a poor CG fest with terrible characters no one likes, and it ends up feeling like a shadow of the original instantly. And what do we get for that? I'm not quite sure where all 35 million of that went, because it's not showing up on screen. Next is Alfred Hitchcock's classic 1960 Psycho. It was made for $807,000 and has probably impacted the horror genre, and particularly the slasher genre, more than anything else I could point to. Now, maybe you do, maybe you don't. You're lucky if you don't, because that means you were spared. The 1998 shot-for-shot remake of Psycho, starring Vince Vaughn as Norman Bates. it was shot for shot, so you might expect, okay, we're gonna have similar budgets here, right? I mean, we're essentially trying to remake the same movie over again. First one was made in 1960, now we're in 1998. It's gotta be a breeze, right? Wrong, because the budget for that remake was $60 million. The first one was made for less than $1 million. This one, $60 million. And it's shit, it's garbage. Get out of my face. While we're in sacred territory, let's talk about another John Carpenter classic, The Thing. This movie was released in 1982 with a budget of $10 million. I would argue that it holds up as well today as it did in 1982. The reason for that being its famously lauded practical effects. They didn't use one bit of any kind of CG because it kind of didn't exist. It was all practical and it holds up. Unlike the prequel to The Thing, $35 million, and what we get is subpar CG, just if we're talking about in the CG spectrum exclusively, much less it even holding a candle to those practical effects from the original in the 80s. So I feel like on this one, get this huge budget, what do? Let's pour it into CG. Unfortunately, that doesn't make it a better movie. Let's talk about 1975's Jaws, the first summer blockbuster ever. And despite its troubled shoot, the shark not working, and the studios trying to cut down the budget, and if I'm not mistaken, Steven Spielberg went over budget like at least 3 times on this movie, and it still came out $7 million, and it is as much a classic today as it was the day that it came out. And then you take that and contrast it with Jaws: The Revenge, which came out in 1987. So we're talking about almost a decade later. And the budget for Jaws: The Revenge was $23 million. So we're talking about 3 times the budget when the shark in the original looked like this. Now, how do you spend 3 times the money and end up with this piece of shit? Going from creatures in the deep to creatures in space. We can't forget Ridley Scott's sci-fi horror classic 1979's Alien. This shit was made for $11 million. And that still blows me away to this day. It's amazing. But you know what's not amazing? Alien Resurrection, 1997's bastard film. It was made for $70 million. So we go from 11 to 70, and just like with Jaws, we go from this iconic horror monster to this abomination. What is it? I feel like it looks like Sling Blade. Like, what is this? Billy Bob Thornton over here like, huggies and mashed taters. What is that? Nobody's scared of that shit. But hey, I'm not here to trash everything. There are special exceptions to the rule on this. Sometimes a sequel can get a bump in budget, and as long as the filmmakers in charge know what made the first one so great and they build on it, then it can work. So a great example of this would be 1988's Child's Play. It had a budget of $9 million, great film, classic in its own right, wonderful. However, 2 years later, in 1990, they released Child's Play 2. Now, it wasn't a huge increase in budget. It went from $9 million to $13 million, but all of the Child's Play Chucky fans that I know say that the second one is superior to the first. And the reason for that is I believe the first movie was a much more confined, contained kind of story in a lot of ways, and we didn't see actually as much Chucky in there as you would think we would, which is kind of cool because, you know, it does build suspense, fair enough. But when you have a character like Chucky, I mean, he's just a visceral, scary character, and it's one of the times the more of him you can get, It's actually the better. And I think that's why Child's Play 2 is the favorite, because it takes this confined world and expands it to where now, instead of it being just the mom and then Andy, you know, and they're dealing with this, is this doll real, what's going on kind of thing, and trying to solve these murders, and she thinks her son is tripping. Then what the second one does is it takes its themes, right, toys, like the whole Child's Play idea itself, and expands upon it. I mean, we have an entire final act that takes place in the toy factory, and the way they utilize it, the way that certain parts of the assembly line become weapons, and then the fact that, you know, they're trying to fight Chucky, he's trying to kill them with certain elements in the factory. They're trying to use that same stuff against him to melt him together, and the whole time you're surrounded by boxes and boxes of good guy dolls. You know, they used it to improve the animatronics of Chucky, so he actually is much more nimble, looks a lot more believable. They knew after making the first one, hey, we could do these things better. They got just enough bump in the budget to do it, and they executed it perfectly. So talking about rarities, it's already uncommon for a sequel to top the original, but it's even more rare for the fourth movie in a franchise to top the original. That's right, I'm talking about Friday the 13th. 1980, the first one, had an $800,000 budget, and yes, they were admittedly trying to bank in on the success of Halloween. But once again, the filmmakers saw what worked about that movie. People were going nuts over that last scene with Jason coming out the water and then grabbing, you know, like the girl, like pulling her under, and everybody wanted to know, oh, what's all this about Jason? They quickly made the very wise decision to make Jason the killer. A lot of people forget, if you're not like really into horror, a lot of people think that Jason is the killer in all of them. In the first one, no, it's his mom. But part two, they improve a little bit. They make Jason the killer instead. Now, he's not iconic Jason. He's not the Jason you and I know and love yet. He's got the burlap bag look aesthetic going on. All right, it's not until chapter 3 that he gets his hockey mask. Now, chapter 3 was a 3D mess and had a $4 million budget, which I'll say is a misstep. As classic as it is, and that is the film, he gets his iconic hockey mask, and there are quite a few iconic kills that happen as well. But the one that I'm talking about that surpasses it is Friday the 13th, the final chapter. It was released in 1984 and with a budget of $1.8 million. Now, once again, I see a theme developing here. The sequels that actually improve on the original, they will have a higher budget, yes, but only marginally so. And I think that speaks to the greater issue at large, is if you know what works about the movie and you're only needing enough to expand on that, then it's going to work. They have the best of all worlds in this. Yes, it doesn't age like well in terms of Me Too and stuff. But we have Jason as the killer, Jason wearing the hockey mask. We actually have characters that are fleshed out. We've got the really awesome appearance of Corey Feldman's character. Everything about it just seemed to align, you know, and that's the first time we ever see the character of Tommy Jarvis in Friday the 13th, who, aside from Jason himself, is probably the most recognizable character in the whole franchise name-wise, and they killed it. Then also, it's safe to say that if you were thinking that you were the person responsible for, they didn't know there were going to be all these other movies after, they really thought it was the final chapter when they made it. So the director goes in, marginally larger budget than the original, thinking, I've got to do this franchise justice. I've got to hit all the hallmarks and then close this thing out in a way that fans are going to love. And this is one of the few franchises that actually pulled it off. Now, for every worst case scenario and for every success, there's also a mixed bag. And that's what this part of this episode is reserved for. And it's for one franchise in particular that instantly came to my mind, which is the Annabelle franchise. We have 2014's Annabelle, which was the first disappointment, I would say, out of the Conjuring universe movies, as far as I can remember. Everyone thought, oh my gosh, we have this haunted doll and this is terrifying and this is gonna work. I mean, it's a surefire hit, right? But it was a dud, and pretty unanimously so. The budget, let's see, was $6.5 million. But then we have the encouraging positive side of the story, Annabelle Creation, which came out 3 years later, 2017, with over double the budget of $15 million. And it was not only a sequel, it was a prequel sequel for an already poorly received original movie. And what did they do? They were smart. They actually took the time and took the opportunity to give us an origin story that characterized everyone involved, the character of Annabelle herself, and actually brought it back to an atmospheric, creepy, haunted doll movie like the first one should have been, and they knocked it out of the park. Now, I wish we could say that it ended there, but unfortunately, no. Just this year, 2019, we got Annabelle Comes Home. And I know that the critical reception of this is like mixed. It's not just like lampooned for being a terrible movie by everyone, but considering that it has a $27 to $32 million budget, which is doubling the budget from the second one, which was double the budget from the first one, and it's the inferior film, says a lot. And it revolves around really depending on jump scares and CG and sound design, but not in a way that builds suspense successfully and then rewards it. And it ends up just feeling like the teeny bopper summer movie to go see, and you forget it immediately, as opposed to Annabelle Creation that to this day I still think back on and comes to mind. So yeah, it's just all that money for something that's somehow exponentially more forgettable. But hey, those are just my thoughts. I'd like to know what you guys think. I'm gonna need your comments down below. Let me know, is there anything that I missed? Are there any things you guys would add to the list? If so, hit us up. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, at BearyVaried. And yeah, man, if you guys click subscribe, then we'll see you next time.